right? The Bible is not presenting things as a scientific thesis. But that doesn't translate to Jordan's conclusion that there's not, quote, accurate scientific style statements in the Bible. Again, it depends on what we're talking about here, because first of all, the Bible is full of a lot of different types of literature, right? There's poetic literature in David's Psalms. Is that going to be scientific? Of course not. There is, prophetic literature in Ezekiel. Is that scientific? No. There is parables. There's allegories, right? There's all of those types. Then there are historical books, right? We read the books of Kings. We read the books of Chronicles. Dang, that's loud, right? And by the way, yes, I will read the super chats from the premiere with Richard, since some of those came in and I wasn't live to read those. So that's true that there are different types of literature, but and we're going to get into this a little bit. There's just a red pill you have to swallow if you're going to go in the domain of religion or theology or Christianity, which is that you can't divorce this religion from its history, from its church in history, from its liturgy, and from its kind of ethos. And Jordan will kind of hit on that and talk about ethos, I think, a little bit in this. But that's the problem with his approach, is that, for example, you couldn't say, oh, I want to get into historic Christianity. Maybe it's Roman Catholicism, maybe it's Orthodoxy. I'll take a look at these. But I'm going to keep my assumptions about Genesis. I'm going to keep my assumptions about what I know to be the case in terms of, I don't know, Carl Jung's archetypes, right? And maybe I'll like some of Christianity, but I know that stuff's correct, and I'm going to make my Christianity mesh with that stuff. You can't do that. And the reason you can't do that is because it's a totality worldview that you are looking into. Right? Now, you may not be convinced. Maybe you don't find Christianity ultimately convincing and you go on to do something else. Right? Maybe. But we have to be honest about what the religion is. And that's, again, the problem that we're going to see in this Dillahunty, Jordan Peterson thing, is that Dillahunty has no grounds for the claims that he makes, right? No justification for what he makes. And he doesn't even know, I'm not trying to be rude, but he doesn't know what it means to talk about epistemic justification. Like, he was totally lost about what that even is in the debate. Jordan, on the other hand, is making some good points and then also falling into the very trap that Dillahunty will correctly call him out for, which is to reduce the religion to something contrary that the religion itself claims about itself, you see. Does historic Christianity say that it has nothing to do with historical claims and facts? Absolutely not. This is a historical religion, right? This is not a religion of you going into a room and meditating to try to get out of your body and go to some other dimension, right? Some sort of, alien rapture. I don't know what, right? Something Hindu yogi or something, right? That's not what this religion is. This is that God came into history. So you cannot divorce Christianity from history. And any attempt to do so makes it into a completely different religion. That's why the genealogies in the book of Luke, right, are so important, because it shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of these messianic prophecies from the Old Testament. We look at the Gospels, for example, and we see Jesus talking about events in the Old Testament. And he talks about Adam and Eve, and he talks about marriage. Does Jesus in the gospel argumentation and apologetic? And yes, if you read the Gospels, you'll notice that Jesus is doing apologetics, right? Does he ever speak as if the events were not historical events? No way, right? He speaks of Adam and Eve as the first people. He speaks of Genesis like it was an accurate telling of what occurred. Now, you may have a hard time with that. A lot of people do. A lot of people say, I just can't believe that. And they think that they're buying into something that is, quote, rational and logical. That's the flip side of that. I just can't believe Genesis. I'm going to believe in Big Bang. I'm going to believe in monkey soup, right? And then you come to find out those are far more fanciful religious positions, right? Under the guise, wearing the cloak of science and scientism. Right? That's, of course, a common argument that we make here. But I just want to point that out, that I think Jordan has really shot himself in the foot by beginning his debate approach by saying that I cannot give any kind of scientific or epistemic certitude, and this is another mistake he makes, which is to equate scientific claims with epistemic certitude. No, I'm sorry, if you knew about epistemology, then you would know that those kinds of claims really don't have a whole lot of authority, right, in terms of epistemology and certitude. I mean, empirical sense data claims are pretty low on the hierarchy of certitude, right? If you have good philosophy, I would say. If you want to hear more about that, you can go listen to the talk that I did about universals, abstract objects, numbers, and the critique of Dr. Ed Fazer's book on Aquinas. So I did that talk maybe a month or two ago. But anyway, let's get back to, but we already see pretty significant bad moves on the part of Jordan here.
But no farther than that. And so the idea that whatever the people who conjured up the Old Testament creation account were doing was something akin to scientific theorizing is a mistake that would only be made by people who don't know how to distinguish between different kinds of truth. And so the fundamentalists...
See, here we go again. This is ambiguous. Distinguishing between different types of biblical literature is not the same thing as distinguishing different types of truth. And I don't know what vocabulary sense Jordan means by different senses of truth. I think he's talking about the point that I make often in debates, which is that not every type of thing is known or proven in the same way, right? Bonson's cracker in the pantry fallacy. I think that's what he's going for. I don't know if he really understands that, but I think that's what he's kind of shooting for. But he's mistakenly, I think, he's approaching the biblical creation account and saying that because it's not presented in a scientific paper style, like Moses is going to write out like a scientific paper and present charts and tables and like footnotes or something, like, since it's not written in that style, it's not presenting apodictic truth or something like that. But that's not even what we say about the creation account, right? So the fact that it says God created in 6 days, rested the seventh day, created Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden. Like, what about that is against, quote, science, right? Because the way that we're going to determine what's possible in our worldview will depend upon the presuppositions of our worldview, you see. So from the outset, what Jordan should have done is what I did in the debate with Matt, is question the presuppositions, right? So instead of shifting into trying to kind of water down the Genesis account, I would have gone for Matt's presuppositions. That's what I did, right, in our debate. And Matt didn't know what to do with that and just kept saying, well, you can't justify or prove something that's a transcendental category presupposition, which is a fundamental philosophical mistake, because transcendental arguments are a type of logical argument. They can be proven. So he didn't know where to go with that. And I think if Jordan had thought about this more and had more of a logical presentation as opposed to this kind of stream of consciousness all over the place, like watering down the thing to try to make it palatable to, fallen man, that's why this doesn't work, right? What does Paul say? Paul says that the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they can't see the kingdom or believe, right? Paul says that we take every thought captive to Christ. So there's nothing autonomous. There's nothing neutral that you can appeal to.
It's like, I feel for the fundamentalists, because what they're trying to do, to give them credit, is to maintain a corpus of stories in which an ethos is based. That would be the Western ethos, in this case of Christianity, because they believe that the ethos is of extreme value. And I also...
Now, this is worth commenting on, because Jordan, of course, equates... Now, he knows about Orthodox Christianity, and this might have been around the time he was maybe newly exposed to it, so maybe he didn't know to not restrict Christianity to the Western ethos. Roman Catholicism is not the summation of what Christianity is, right? But But certainly elements of Christianity obviously have influenced the Western ethos. So, okay, but the real mistake here is about fundamentalism, right? And if you want to know more specifically about the problem with using this phrase or term, go to the talk I did about 4 years ago critiquing the overly allegorical approach of Father Stephen Freeman, which is still on my channel. You have to dig back a little while, but Jordan is doing the same thing there, where the idea is that, look, these Old Testament stories, they're not actual events, okay? They're allegorical, crazy tales that we just kind of have to, find a moral meaning in the midst of, this kind of stuff, right? Now, this is a confusion, and if you disagree, they'll say, oh, you're a fundamentalist, right? Now, this is a confusion between a hermeneutical error and a question of textual issues, okay? Hermeneutics is the interpretation of text. So, for example, in the Orthodox Church, in the history of the church, both East and West, for the first 1,000 years, especially as you get up into the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, you get what's called the fourfold sense of Scripture. And this is a kind of loose pattern that many of the church fathers, basing themselves on the apostolic hermeneutic, kind of deduced as to ways to understand the levels of the text. And the first level is the literal historical. And on that, you build the other layers, which are like the analogical and then anagogical and then allegorical, right? So you can have these different layers of meaning that relate to morals, that relate to eschatology, and then that relate to allegory, right? And Paul does this in Galatians 4, where he makes an allegory about the story of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. But if you notice in Paul's allegory, he doesn't ahistoricize Genesis. He actually bases the allegory on the reality of the historical events. And that's the key here. By the way, if you read Maximus the Confessor's book, Ad Thalassium, the Catholic University Press that has the Father Maximus introduction, the introduction notes that very point about Maximus. Maximus never dehistoricized or made the historical events ahistorical. He would base any allegorization on the reality of the history. And he notes that and admits that in that introductory chapter and essay. Likewise, if you read the Father Seraphim Rose book, there's multiple quotes where Father Rose points out this very point. Father Seraphim says that he has some great quotes from St. Cyril of Alexandria about the fact that you can't take allegory to make the historical not real. And I know this is hard for people to fathom, but if somebody like Jordan really ought to spend maybe a year in this or in the Church Fathers if he really wanted to know how to get out of this quandary of modernism and modernity.
I also believe that the ethos is of extreme value and that it is nested in those stories. And so they don't like to be confronted by the rationalist, atheist, evolutionary types because it blows the foundation of their ethos apart and they feel that it's worth preserving. And I think, well, yeah, it is worth preserving. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't philosophical problems associated with the manner in which they construct their arguments. But, they're still worthy. But it doesn't address the issue. There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. Here's an example. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think so. I just finished. Well, I thought about it a lot, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore, right? And being wrong is actually not a good thing. You fall into a pit if you're wrong.
And this is what I point out in the lecture on skepticism, since you didn't get to see the show, is that being wrong feels exactly like being right.
By the way, it's pages 39, 40, 41 that touch on the point I just made.
Nobody runs around going, oh, I'm wrong, but I'm going to keep believing this. We all assume that we are correct about a great many things. And it's not so much that being wrong is the thing we're afraid of. I think that being exposed as wrong is the thing we're afraid of.
I also wanted to read this quote from St. Cyril, which comes up often. And since St. Cyril's making this point about hermeneutics, St. Cyril says in Questions on John, this is page 129, 23 in the Father Seraphim Rose book. He says, in Galatians 4:24, it is explained that the apostle wrote this not to reject the historical facts, but to relate the type to the reality. St. Cyril writes in Questions on John 1 that one cannot apprehend rightly the scriptures if one attempts to contemplate their spiritual meaning without respecting the historical meaning. Quote, those who reject the historical meaning of the scriptures in the God-inspired texts as something obsolete are avoiding the ability to apprehend rightly. According to the proper manner, the things which are written in them. For indeed, spiritual contemplation is good and profitable, and it enlightens the eyes of the eyes of reason, especially well. It reveals the wisest of things. For whenever some historical event is apprehended to us in the scriptures, in that instance, a useful search into the historical meaning is appropriate, in order that the God-inspired scriptures be revealed as salvific and beneficial to us in every way. And then Father Rose has multiple texts there where he finds other church fathers illustrating the same point, which is just simply that it just doesn't work to, take the allegory as the rejector of the historicity. This is a false presupposition. Every biblical allegory, in the sense of allegories built on historical events I'm talking about. Sometimes allegories are using, mythical imagery or some purely symbolic imagery, sure. But, you can't say, oh, well, then Genesis is purely symbolic because it doesn't jive with what I think science says. But, you see, Jesus trumps what science says, right? Because Jesus says that Adam and Eve were historical people, right? If Adam and Eve and the events of Genesis weren't historical, then there's not a basis for marriage, right, as a grounded in nature, you could say, contract. Why do we have marriage? Right? This is an argument Dr. Lyle uses, which I think is a powerful argument. And by the way, how is Jesus the second Adam? If Adam and Eve were just sort of, evolved figures. Now, again, a lot of people say, well, I can't accept that. I'm not going to believe this religion, and they move on. But to try to blend this religion with something that's completely contrary to the account is just disastrous, right? I mean, it's not going to work. The whole redemptive scheme will fall apart.
Well, we're also sometimes afraid of being wrong, because if you're wrong at a deep level, it can really hurt you.
Oh, I agree.
It can really take you apart. And so people don't like to be taken apart. Like if you're wrong about your wife, for example, that tends to be a very painful thing. And that's something that's worth pursuing to try to figure out why that is.
That's why I hide the frying pan.
Boomer joke.
That should make you popular. Okay, so one of the issues that I have, and you can respond to this, is that the let's say the celebrity atheist types, because I actually like that phrase, they don't seem to me to be contending with the real issues. They seem to be going. What are the real issues? Dostoevsky.
No, this is a weird turn. I think from a rhetoric perspective, it's interesting that Jordan is throwing in literary things, right? What's the real issues? You think Jordan's going to say something philosophical, and he says Dostoevsky, right? Dostoevsky's existential dilemma of man, and Raskolnikov and A Crime and Punishment, or Notes from the Underground, or something like this. Yeah, that's actually a good point, but outside of rhetoric, it's not really a good argument. It doesn't prove or disprove anything really when you're appealing to. And I understand it from the rhetorical perspective, right? If I was in the midst of debate, I might say, consider the great figures like Dostoevsky, right? My favorite author, right? He asks questions about man's dilemma, and then, maybe that could be a segue into an argument. But just to talk about the fact that man has these kind of existential crises and dilemmas, this sort of stream of consciousness approach is it's almost all rhetoric, right? It's like I'm not hearing any actual substantive argument yet in all of this stream of consciousness talking that he's doing. It's like Veganica, right? The so-called debate, right? Quote debate, No arguments, just sort of talking, like just give like it's like a beat poet or something, like the poets that do like freestyling or something, right? Okay, freestyling is not an argument, right? We need a substantive argument here, and we've not gotten it yet.
He's a real issue. Tolstoy, he's a real issue. Carl Jung,
Tolstoy's
20
terrible,
books
by the
and
way.
maybe 15 seminars. He's a real issue.
Okay, so Dostoevsky is a real issue. Tolstoy is a real issue. Carl Jung, 20 books and his seminars is a real issue. What? I mean, if I was an atheist, like a atheist logician, right? Which that position is completely ridiculous. And I'm hearing this, I'm thinking, this is an argument? I mean, this is preposterous. Like, what are you talking about? So I think what he's trying to say is that why would writers ask really difficult questions and tell amazing narratives if this wasn't really, if they weren't hitting on something? Okay, but what are they hitting on, right? I mean, are they grappling with God? Yeah, to a degree, especially Crime and Punishment. Yeah, so maybe that's what his argument is. By the way, who wants to read Tolstoy? Give me a break. Garbage, right?
Mircea Eliade. Like, there are some serious heavy hitters.
Now, Eliade is an interesting writer, right? I've read Sacred and the Profane. I've got his book on shamanism over there, which is a fascinating book. I've got his book on Nietzsche. I've got Johann Kuliano, which was his mentor or his student, however it goes. I've got Eliade's whole 3-volume series on the history of religion. Yeah, there's some really awesome, amazing, fascinating comparative religion in Eliade, but this shotgun machine gun approach of appealing to like literary comparative religion psychology figures is just bizarre.
Hitters in the religious phenomenology domain. And my sense so far.
By the way, let's make a distinction too between people who get into the Bible or orthodoxy via the route of perennialism, Eliade, comparative religion, Carl Jung. Yes, that happens. But that has nothing to do with whether the arguments are good or whether Christianity is true or false. Right? The route that you came to something has literally nothing to do with the validity of the argument being made. I mean, it's fascinating. It's unique to you and your existential history and story, right? Your origin story. But it's not anything approaching an argument.
I just finished reading all of Harris's books, for example. He doesn't contend with them at all. And it's like, for me, that's like being an...
Okay, but why should Sam Harris contend with those figures? Because they're popular? I mean, does that mean Sam Harris should contend with Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, Billie Eilish? I mean, they're popular. Is popularity what we're supposed to... And Jordan say, "Oh no, their intellectual product, what they produced intellectually." And I'm like, there's an infinite variety of intellectual products out there, and the fact that some people are popular has literally nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the claim. So Matt is correct to kind of sit back and just let this emotional appeal to like. It's not really No True Scotsman. It's kind of like, and it's not exactly an emotional appeal. It's a version of emotional appeal where it's like, if you really want to be an intellectual or a deep thinker, you would deal with this, right? And it's just, that's a fallacy.
An evolutionary biologist and not being aware of Darwin. It's actually a big problem. It's not something you can hand wave away. Jung was a mystic. It's like, sorry.
Okay, but what Jordan's not going for is the fact that from Matt's worldview, from Matt's perspective, he doesn't care about literary greats. He doesn't care about psychological Carl Jung, dream analysis. He doesn't see that as having any value really, aside from however it can be translated into his reductionism. So if you're dealing with a reductionist, to machine gun throw at him a bunch of cool books that you read. You read Lord of the Rings, bro? Like, they don't care. That's just stories. And they don't realize that they're telling a story, but that's the thing is that what what I tried to do, and maybe I should have just said this, like to Matt, is that Matt, you don't realize that in your attempt to get away from storytelling, aka Christianity, and your adoption of skeptical materialism, atheism, you're just telling another story. But it's an even stupider story because it has less grounding, and not only less grounding, it can't ground anything at all. It's completely arbitrary and ad hoc. And he admitted that, and he's like, but so what? Okay, well, thank you. That's the end of the debate. Once you admit that your arguments are arbitrary and ad hoc, all I have to do is respond by saying, then God just is. Right? If you can be ad hoc, I can be ad hoc. And that's why you can't do that in a debate, obviously.
He was about as smart as Friedrich Nietzsche.
I think this gets to basically the same.
So this is it's unbelievable to me that Jordan would make this kind of an argument. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but he's saying, I forget who he listed. Who was his last one? Was it Eliade was the last one? He says Eliade is at least as smart as Nietzsche. Okay, but Matt doesn't care about Nietzsche. I mean, Matt may like the fact that Nietzsche is an atheist, but Matt doesn't care about who amongst the world's prized literary figures has a high IQ. And by the way, Matt is actually correct to say that that's all irrelevant. Who cares? Like, it's interesting that certain people have high IQs, but that's really just a kind of weird appeal to popularity and an appeal to authority. I'd say, so what Jordan is doing is this rhetoric that is a combination of three fallacies, right? No true intellectual would ignore these people. That's no true Scotsman fallacy. He's doing a version of the emotional appeal that, you can't really call yourself a thinker or an intellectual or a strong, minded person until you've dealt with these heavy hitters. That's an emotional appeal. So it's kind of a blending of these fallacies. And it's, interesting from a rhetorical perspective, I guess. But, from a logical debate perspective, Matt really doesn't have to. Matt can just say, yeah, that's all irrelevant. So that's nice and flowery language, Jordan, but it's not an argument.